I'm Paul Bloom. I'm the professor for Moralities of Everyday Life. This is Christina Starmans, who's the teaching fellow for our course. And I want to welcome people to the second installment of Office Hours. The first installment of Office Hours, which covered week one, was very popular. About over 10,000 people watched it. And so we're hoping for a similar, we're delighted by this and hoping for a similar response for our second week. Just as with the first week, I want to begin by talking about the discussion boards. So first, I want to announce and praise the people who are our major contributors. So apologies for names that I mangle, but I'd like to particularly thank Judith Nicholson, Anthony Quinn, Miko Kangasalo, Rod Moore, Robert Veitch, Stephen Morris, and David Benson. There were a lot of contributors. There's about 5,000 comments on the boards right now from about 2,000 people. And I haven't read all of them, but I've read a lot of them. I've spent more time than I'm willing to admit looking them over, scratching my head, nodding, disagreeing. And the issues are fascinating. People talked about, there's an excellent discussion about religion and Sam Harris and other issues. There's discussion of moral people who you view as the most moral people. There's a lot of talk about psychopaths, where some people describe themselves as psychopaths, and there's a back and forth. Some people describe, and these are actually kind of sad, interactions they've had with psychopaths in the past. There's some discussion about the mechanics of the course. I wanted to very briefly mention about the quizzes. So in response to people's comments, the way the quizzes now work is that when you're done with a quiz, you'll see your answers and you'll see the right answer. So if you get things wrong, you're told what the right answer is, and you're told where to find the right answer. So they said, oh, the right answer is in this article or this lecture. And I think people would find that helpful. Only the first quiz counts, but you could take the quizzes as many times as you want to try to improve your score, to try to see what you got wrong, and see if you could figure it out on the fly, and so on. One of the more interesting discussion threads was initiated by a question that I raised about dropping the lowest quiz. I sort of had thought that everybody would say, sure, that's a great idea, but actually there was a quite interesting disagreement, about 50-50. And because of this, I decided not to change it. I said ahead of time I would only change it if there was a strong majority, and this wasn't the case. What I want to raise, though, is I found the arguments back and forth from a moral point of view to be particularly interesting. And many people who were in favor of the idea of dropping lowest quiz would say, look, if you don't care about it, what difference does it make to you? Just let me drop the lowest quiz. Why should you care? And then the people who were against dropping the lowest quiz said, why do you care about dropping lowest quiz? It isn't a course for credit. Why do you care? And I think both sides are sort of in some way showing a lack of empathy when you say that, because we care about these things. Not everything we care about in life is tangible and physical and material. Sometimes we care about things of symbolic value. And passing a quiz is something of symbolic value. And I think each side appreciated that tacitly when they made their arguments back and forth. And so in general, I find the discussion boards exhilarating. I think 99% of people on the boards are there on good faith, showing good behavior, showing respect for others. And so I'm going to continue to monitor it, and I hope people continue to participate in them. And now we have questions. And what we're going to do, which is a little bit different from last time, is Christina's going to ask the questions, and she's going to say the name of the person who the question came from. Like me, she's going to try her best to pronounce these names properly, but may fail, like me. And then I will respond, and it'll be fun.
Okay, so we start with an easy one. Kelly Mutter has asked, what motivates this MOOC? So it seems like it's a lot of work on the part of a lot of people. Doesn't seem like Yale needs the exposure. What's motivating the MOOC?
So there's two ways to ask the question. You can say, what's motivating the MOOC from Yale's point of view? And I think it's just part of Yale's plan for world domination, just an essential part. But more seriously, that Yale has many goals, and one goal is education of the students here. And these MOOCs actually serve that purpose, because the lectures that we tape can be used in classrooms here, what's called a flipped classroom, where students might watch the lectures at home on their computer and then devote the class time to discussion. Yale has a large network of alumni, and I think they would particularly benefit from being able to go back and take Yale courses. But I think the big reason why Yale is doing this seriously is one of the goals of this university, and it's a great university, one of the goals is the dissemination of knowledge. And right now there are very few people can attend Yale, but this is a way that they could, that this university could devote some resources, and substantial amount of resources, to spreading these classes to the world. And then the question is, why do I do it? And that's my answer as well. I like teaching. I think it's important and rewarding to get these ideas to as broad an audience as possible. And you know, I teach here. I teach seminars of 18 kids, 18 students, classes of 200, 300, 400 students. And the idea of teaching to a class that starts off as 70,000 students is, to me, exhilarating. And I feel it's a morally good thing to do.
Great. Okay, next question is from Dragos Moldovan. He asks, well, you've talked about various approaches to morality, a consequentialist approach, a deontological approach. We talked about virtue ethics in last week's office hours a bit. And he asks, well, isn't the best approach for your average person just to blend all of these into one kind of philosophy?
I think there's that temptation. I think sometimes we hear of a moral problem, and our gut feeling is we should be consequentialists, we should be utilitarians. Then we hear about another moral issue, and we say we should be, Kantians. And another one strikes us as virtue ethics seems like the best approach. But the problem is that we always have to make these choices. And if we arbitrarily say, and if we pick our moral philosophy depending on our gut feelings at the time, we're not really having a moral philosophy. We're just feeling what we feel and then choosing a philosophy as a way to justify it. And the problem is, in the real world, these philosophies give us different answers. They give us different answers as to whether it's right for gay people to marry, or for a president to use drones to bomb a foreign country, or the trolley problem, to choose an abstract one. Your moral philosophy will give you different answers. And so the act of making a choice, if you say, I'm going to choose which one to be, well, you're going to need a moral philosophy to tell you what choice to make. Should you be a consequentialist or should you be a deontologist? So in some way it pushes the question back. I don't think we walk around with consistent moral philosophies in our heads. I think people are, I think the point is correct, that we do kind of pick and choose. But often we're forced to struggle with the question of what the right thing is to do, and then we need something to guide us.
Okay. So how would you characterize your own moral philosophy? And this question comes from Jean Kjellgaard Christensen.
So I try to avoid personal questions in this sort of thing, but I will answer that one. I've often struggled with it. I'm a consequentialist. I think that the morality of something rests entirely on its consequences. But I'm a nervous and uncertain consequentialist. And I respect the idea, emphasized by Jonathan Haidt, among other people, that often consequences can be indirect and subtle and uncertain. So take torture. I have no doubt at all that there are all sorts of cases where torturing somebody saves lives. And in that moment, the pain of the tortured person is nothing compared to the pain that would incur if the person wasn't tortured, if we didn't find out where the bomb was, and so on. I have no doubt about that. But I'm still against torture. And I'm against torture because I worry, like a lot of people, that even though it might be right for that moment, in the long run, having a society where people have the right to torture prisoners or torture suspected criminals corrodes the society. And from a cold-blooded consequentialist point of view, it makes things wrong in the long run. I mean, here's an example I actually give to my kids when talking. If it's 3 in the morning and nobody's on the street and there's a red light, should you just drive through it, knowing no one will be hurt? And the answer is no, you should stop. You should stop and obey the law, not because you're some sort of Kantian or deontologist, but because in general it's good to obey the law, to obey traffic laws. even in cases where you know full well that is pointless. So, I mean, the technical term is, I guess, I'm a rule utilitarian or a rule consequentialist. But that's where I stand.
Can you just define rule consequentialist a little more?
So there's a distinction between act consequentialism and rule consequentialism. Act just focuses on what people do on the spot. So if torture would save more lives, then it would end, would cause more pleasure, cause less pain in the long run, you should do it. And we think about each act as sort of a basic act. But rule utilitarianism, rule consequentialism says sometimes it's good to have a rule that dictates your behavior and dictates your action, even if certain specific applications of the rule lead you astray. So an example is, in the United States, you can't drink until you're a certain age. You can't drink until you're 21. Used to be 18. You can't drink until you're 21. And nobody doubts that there's all sorts of 20-year-olds who'd be perfectly fine drinking, or that there's all sorts of 22-year-olds who shouldn't be allowed to drink. There's also 40-year-olds who shouldn't be allowed to drink. But you make a rule, and you apply the rule, and the world is better off for having a rule, even though specific applications might lead you astray.
Thanks. So the next question comes from Bjorn Halson, who says, well, you mentioned Batson's work this week, but you didn't focus on what has been a central question for Batson, which is whether empathy can trigger altruistic motivations. So can we really be sort of purely motivated by empathy and purely altruistic?
So that's a great question. Dan Batson is a wonderful psychologist, and he's devoted so much of his career to the question of why are we good to other people? And he has proposed what he calls the empathy-altruism hypothesis, which we discussed in class, where the empathetic feelings you have makes you genuinely care for other people and help them out of genuine care. And the alternative, there's alternatives. One alternative is that, yeah, you help people, but you do it for selfish reasons. And there's a whole list of selfish reasons, but one selfish reason is the buzz you get from helping somebody. You feel good about yourself, you feel its satisfaction. And so you do it for selfish reasons. You do it for the buzz. You don't do it because you care about the other person. And what Batson's done over the last many years is he's constructed dozens, probably hundreds of experiments that try to pull this apart. And he has a book that just came out about a year ago called Altruism in Humans, where he explores this. And he argues, I think convincingly, that the buzz explanation doesn't work. And so I invite people to look at his studies, but what I would add is that on an intuitive level, this sort of cynical, selfish theory of altruism doesn't seem to work. And I'll give you one example. I have two sons who I love very much, two teenage boys. And I do things for them because I love them, because I want them to be happy. And now the cynic would say, no, I don't. I don't care about them. What I care about is that I feel good when doing them. But I actually do things for them. I have wishes for their happiness that would continue even after I'm dead. And I could put things in place like saving money for them and making plans and everything that are meant to play even when I'm dead. I don't expect to be satisfied by their happiness when I'm dead. I think that there's not much reason to give up on the common sense view that we often love other people. We want them to be happy. We also hate other people, want them to be sad, but we have these feelings towards other people that don't reduce to feelings towards ourselves. And some people say, oh, well, that's crazy from an evolutionary point of view. But I argue in my book, Just Babies, and I argue in the lectures that that's a misunderstanding of evolution. Evolution does work through the sort of relentless propagation of genes. And next week we talk a lot more about evolution. But evolution could build brains that really care about other people, that really care about kin and friends, feel real other emotions. And I think Batson's conclusion supports this, and I think he's right.
Okay, so what about the other side, the other end of the spectrum? So so this question comes from Elizabeth Mitru, and she says, well, if a psychopath's lack of empathy can cloud his moral judgment, what about someone who's super empathetic, who's at the other end of the spectrum?
Yeah.
Can that cloud their moral judgment?
It's a really interesting issue. So part of the readings for this week that we're talking about was an article of mine that was critical of empathy. And so I'm sort of very attuned to that issue. Can you have too much empathy? Is there an opposite of a psychopath? Now, some people think the opposite of a psychopath would be a tremendously good person. The psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen talks about different extremes. He says the psychopath is the worst person in the world with no empathy, no caring. But then you have people on the other side who are highly empathetic, and they're wonderful people, they're terrific people. I disagree. I think if you have too much empathy, it can paralyze you. If you care too much for people viscerally, it makes you unable to act and sometimes makes you irrational. Steven Pinker has a nice example in his book, Better Angels of Our Nature. He says, you see a kid, and the kid's terrified by a howling dog, and the kid's weeping and screaming. Well, what's your best moral act? Well, to help out the kid, to pick up the kid, to reassure the kid. But if you're super empathetic and you start living with the kid and you start weeping and screaming, you're useless. I also think that too much empathy will cause you to overvalue the suffering of one person in front of you, often at the expense of the suffering of many who you don't see. So I think for empathy, I'm against empathy as a policy choice, but I think, everybody wants to have a sort of a decent amount of empathy, but too much can be as bad as too little.
And I think this is something we'll come back to in several future lectures.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, a great question from Dana Taylor, and she says, the only question that matters, cake or pie?
Cake or pie? That's an important question, but it's not a difficult question. I often find myself ordering cake, but the answer has to be pie. The problem with cake is almost always monotonous. Cake is too much of the same. Now, I know you're talking about frosting versus the rest of the cake, but often the frosting and the rest of the cake, you can't fully tell the difference. Now, pie, you have the what do you call the cover of pie?
The crust.
The crust, that's it. They'll edit this out. You have the crust, and then you have the filling. And these are two of the most different flavors in the world. And so a nice apple pie gives you a sort of a range of flavor sensations. That is often challenging, but often I think cake is the coward's way out. Where do you stand on this important issue?
Well, I like the pie as diversity answer, but actually I have to say neither one. I'm blessed with a dislike for both cake and pie, but if you put some chocolate chip cookies in front of me, I'm in trouble.
Cookies or brownies?
Brownies.
But brownies are like cake.
People say that, but it's really quite false. Brownies are dense, they're moist, and much better than cake.
Okay, we'll talk about this in future office hours.
Okay, next question is an anonymous question posed in the forum. What do you think about the rise of sort of the internet and other kinds of technology? How has that contributed to our moral behavior? You might see a decline in morality with the availability of all kinds of illicit material on the internet.
Yeah.
Or you might think that it has an overall good effect on our moral lives through Coursera and TED Talks and things like that.
It's a hard question because there's no doubt one could point to the internet and point to terrible things that happen over the internet. Cyberbullying, various forms of social attack and social ostracism, brutal acts that are then videotaped and put online. And it's also not hard to see that there's all sorts of things on the internet that really improve people's lives. If you're a lonely kid in a small town in the middle of nowhere, if you were, many years ago, you could be lonely forever. And now, if you have an internet connection, you could connect yourself to other people, and it could make a profound difference. And so there's a lot of good and bad. I'll make an observation, which is people often think the world is going to hell and things are getting worse and worse. But as Pinker talks about, we'll talk about this later on in the class, that since, for the last many, many years, violent crime has been dropping. Certainly in America, the homicide rate has dropped by about half over the last 30 years. Robbery, rape, assault, all of them have been dropping. Now, I'm not saying the internet has been making us nicer people, but I'm saying that the internet has developed, become popular, in a world which doesn't seem to be getting any worse. So I'd be very cautious of people who say that the internet is making us into worse people. I guess what I would think is that the internet could accelerate different appetites we have. If one is cruel or sadistic or somehow troubled, the internet can help people unleash their worst instincts. But it's also an enormous mechanism for altruism and kindness. And you know, one could think about online donations and so on, but I didn't think of little things. Like sometimes on a discussion board, somebody says, I have a problem with this quiz, or could somebody help me do this? People immediately chime in to help. And that's extraordinary. I mean, it's extraordinary that people will do this though they get no reward. And I think the internet has become, in some way, a mechanism through which people could express all sorts of kindness.
You know, one thing the internet seems to do is connects us in a way that wasn't possible before the rise of the internet. Maybe that's having some effect on expanding the group of people that we can be empathetic towards or kind towards.
I think that's right, and it's not just numbers, it's range. So before the internet, I might know a lot of people, but they'd kind of all be from my neighborhood. They'd all be people I encounter. But now we get to encounter people on the discussion boards right now on those questions who live in faraway countries, who we would never encounter in any other way. So it's really quite extraordinary.
Great. Okay, so Matt asks, do you think that ethics and morality professors, having studied a lot of these issues about what's the best moral philosophy, what's moral psychology really like, are they better people than average?
So I'd like to answer yes, because a lot of the thing I'm arguing for, I've argued in these lectures, I've argued is that the power of reason, the power of deliberation. So these people who do moral reasoning for a living, you'd expect to be really nice people. Sadly, the answer is probably no. There's actually research done on this, where you do all sorts of studies on ethics professors, and you compare them to other philosophers, you compare them to chemistry professors, and you compare them to people who aren't professors at all. And it turns out they aren't nicer, really. So one study found that they're much more likely to say that they care about animal rights and be vegetarians. But then when you ask them what they actually do and what they eat, they're not any more likely to actually be vegetarians. They just think it's a good thing. Then there was another study which was very cool where they asked people, including ethics professors, do you think you should respond to student email? So if a student sends you an email and says, I'm having problems with the course or I want some advice, do you think you should respond? And many of the ethics professors said yes. It is a moral imperative to respond to somebody who reached out to you in good faith. What the professors didn't know was for the last year they had been the subject of an experiment where the experimenters sent them emails coming from students. And it turned out a lot of professors who said this was an important moral imperative actually didn't answer student emails. So not so much.
Okay. So Leah Cohen asks, what's your opinion about morality being relative? So if they're a consequence of these various things like emotions, disgust, culture that can change over time and from place to place, it seems like maybe morality is subjective and, sort of there are various systems that could be considered right.
So it's a deep question. What do we think of morality? Are we moral relativists and so there's no right and wrong? Are we realists so we think there's a right answer and a wrong answer? And I tend towards the realist side. So the question is correct, that we are swayed by all sorts of arbitrary and accidental facts of our culture, of our emotions, and you'd think that makes it all kind of relative. But at the same time, we also could use reason and logic and argument. We could say, this is a goal we want to achieve, say happiness of most people, and then we could argue and think our way through on how to solve it. And so in some way I make an analogy with science, or say astronomy. So astronomers study planets and stars and the structure of the universe. And when they do this, they are subject to their biases, their ambitions, their political prejudices, their religious beliefs, everything sways them in all different ways. Yet still, they make discoveries. They discover that the Earth revolves around the sun, that stars are clustered into galaxies, and so on. They discover truths. And so I think in morality, we can do the same thing.
Great. And so I'm going to end with a question that actually resonates really deeply with me as well, which is from Dimitra Basiku, who asks, Is it normal that since I heard the views of Peter Singer, I feel guilty for everything bad that's going wrong in the world?
So I'll answer and I'll end by asking you whether you feel the same way. But yes. If you believe Singer's argument, you should feel intense guilt. If you live like me, in some degree of luxury and spending money on things you don't need, if Singer is correct, you should feel bad. You're doing something wrong. You're not literally killing people, but you're close. If you did something different, you'd be saving lives, and you're choosing not to. Now, some people hear this and say, well, then Singer can't be right. I don't want to be that uncomfortable. But that's not a good argument. It's not a good argument to say if the conclusion is true, I'd be upset, so it can't be true. You got to look at the argument. And I'm persuaded enough by what Peter Singer says that it's changed my life in some regards, and I'm persuaded enough to think that I'm persuaded enough to still feel guilty about a life I lead. What about you?
I'm sympathetic to that view. I think that that the answer to the question, is it normal, is maybe no. Because I think that a lot of people are more like Louis C.K. So even if you hear the view of Peter Singer, even if you sort of really engage with and let it affect you, as I think Louis C.K. seems to have done, he's still, driving around in his car, doing the same thing that he's always been doing. And I think that that's sort of the typical response is just denial, just head in the sand. That's really bad. I don't want to think about that conclusion. And if I did, it would make me feel terribly guilty.
I think you're right. I mean, as people, anybody who's been on discussion boards will know that the reading, the assignment that generates by far the most discussion was Sam Harris's TED Talk. But Sam Harris is not the most controversial resource I've used in my courses. I often assign something by Peter Singer. I assign an article he wrote where he says that the wealthy people of the world are doing something horrible by not giving away their resources to the poor. And the response I get from students in my classes is not, oh, I feel so guilty. It's, what a jerk. It's rage. Rage or indifference or something must have gone wrong. And so it's true. To answer the question literally, it is actually not that normal to feel that guilty. But I think we should, if we're convinced by the argument, feel that guilty. Thank you. Thank you for joining me in office hours. Thank you all for watching. And we'll see you all next week as we discuss the issues and questions that come up for our third week of the course.